Hello and good morning. Welcome back to Storytime Classics with Southwest Shakespeare. My name is Amy Bjorklund. I am your reader today, and we are about halfway through Daphne du Maurier's Jamaica Inn. This is our second one we've read. We read Rebecca first and loved it, and so now we have this one. Welcome to Stanley and Catherine. I love seeing you virtually each time and hearing how you are both doing. Good morning. I'm doing very well for a Tuesday in May, our first fantastic May reading. We're going to the Christmas fair today, so we are at the Christmas fair. My apologies. We're there. We just saw Jem sell the horse back to the owners, and we saw Mary really like it. So she is definitely falling for the bad boy. And now we're going to see what happens next. And good morning, Catherine. I also am looking forward to seeing what happens next. We were in the middle of the chapter, so thankfully Bo helped remind me we should be, if I am thinking correctly, we should be on page 175. And we just sold the pony back to Mrs. Besat herself. And now Jem and Mary are going to go off on wild adventures, I'm sure. So off we go. There was a ripple of excitement in the air. That was our last sentence. Jem caught at her hand and crumpled the fingers. "You're glad you came, aren't you?" he said. And "Yes," she said recklessly, and she did not mind. They plunged into the thick of the fair with all the warmth and the suggestion of packed humanity about them. Jem bought Mary a crimson shawl and gold rings for her ears. They sucked oranges beneath a striped tent and had their fortunes told by a wrinkled gypsy woman. "Beware of a dark stranger," she said to Mary, and they looked at one another and laughed again. "There's blood on your hand, young man," she told him. "You'll kill a man one day." And, "What did I tell you in the jingle this morning?" said Jem. "I'm innocent as yet. Do you believe it now?" But she shook her head at him. She would not say. Little raindrops splashed onto their faces, and they did not care. The wind rose in gusts and billowed the fluttering tents, scattering paper and ribbons and silks, and a great striped booth shuddered in an instant and crumbled, while apples and oranges rolled in the gutter. Flares streamed in the wind, the rain fell, and people ran hither and thither for shelter, laughing and calling to one another, the rain streaming from them. Jem dragged Mary under cover of a doorway, his arms around her shoulders, and he turned her face against him and held her with his hands and kissed her. "Beware of a dark stranger," he said, and he laughed and kissed her again. The night clouds had come up with the rain, and it was black in an instant. The wind blew out the flares, the lanterns glowed dim and yellow, and all the bright color of the fair was gone. The square was soon deserted. The striped tents and the booths gaped empty and forlorn. The soft rain came in gusts from the doorway, and Jem stood his back to the weather, making a screen for Mary. He untied the handkerchief she had wore and played with her hair. She felt the tips of his fingers on her neck, traveling to her shoulders, and she put up her hands and pushed them away. "I've made a fool of myself long enough for one night, Jem Merlin," she said. "It's time we thought of returning. Let me alone." "You don't want to ride in an open jingle in this wind, do you?" he said. "It's coming from the coast and we'll be blown under in the high ground. We'll have to spend the night together in Launceston." "Very likely. Go and fetch the pony, Jem, while this shower lifts for the moment. I'll wait for you here." "Don't be a Puritan, Mary. You'll be soaked to the skin on the Bodmin Road. Pretend you're in love with me, can't you? You'll stay with me then." "Are you talking to me like this because I am the barmaid at Jamaica Inn?" "Damn Jamaica Inn! I like the look of you and the feel of you, and that's enough for any man. It ought to be enough for a woman, too." "I dare say it is for some. I don't happen to be made that way." "Do they make you different from other women, then, out on Helford River? Stay here with me tonight, Mary, and we can find out. You'd be like the rest by the time morning came. I take my oath on that." "I haven't a doubt of it. That's why I'd rather risk a soaking in the jingle." "God, you're as hard as flint, Mary Yellen. You'll be sorry for it when you're alone again." "Better be sorry than later." "If I kissed you again, would you change your mind?" "I would not." I don't wonder my brother took his bed and his bottle for a week with you in the house. Do you sing psalms to him? I dare say I did. I've never known a woman so perverse. I'll buy a ring for you if it would make you feel respectable. It's not often I have money enough to make in my pocket to make the offer. How many wives do you have? 6 or 7 scattered over Cornwall. I don't count the ones across the Tamar. That's good number for one man. I'd wait a while before I took an 8th if I were you. You're sharp, aren't you? You look like a monkey in that shawl of yours with your bright eyes. All right, I'll fetch the jingle and take you home to your aunt, but I'll kiss you first, whether you like it or not. He took her face in his hands. 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy. I'll give you the rest when you're in a more yielding frame of mind. It wouldn't do to finish the rhyme tonight. Stay where you're to, I'll not be long. He bowed his head against the rain and strode across the street. She saw him disappear behind the line of stalls and so around the corner. She leant back once more within the shelter of the door. It would be desolate enough on the high road, she knew that. This was a real driving rain with a venomous wind behind it, and there would be little mercy from the moors. It required a certain amount of courage to stand those 11 miles in an open jingle. The thought of staying in Launceston with Jem Merlin made her heart beat faster, perhaps, and it was exciting to think upon it now he was gone and he could not see her face. But for all that, she would not lose her head to please him. Once she departed from the line of conduct she had laid down for herself, there would be no returning. There would be no privacy of mind, no independence. She had given away too much as it was, and she would never be entirely free of him again. This weakness would be a drag on her and make the 4 walls of Jamaica Inn more hateful than they were already. It was better to bear solitude alone. Now the silence of the moors would be a torrent because of his presence 4 miles distance from her. Mary wrapped her shawl around her and folded her arms. She wished that women were not the frail things of straw she believed them to be. Then she could stay this night with Jem Merlin and forget herself as he could forget, and both of them part with a laugh and a shrug of the shoulder in the morning. But she was a woman, and it was impossible. A few kisses had made a fool of her already. She thought of Aunt Patience, trailing like a ghost in the shadow of her master, and she shuddered. That would be Mary Yellen too, but for the grace of God and her own strength of will. A gust of wind tore at her skirt, and another shower of rain blew in the open doorway. It was colder now. Puddles ran in the cobbled stones, and the light and the people had vanished. Launceston had lost its glamour. It would be a bleak and a cheerless Christmas Day tomorrow. Mary waited, stamping her feet and blowing upon her hands. Jem was taking his time to fetch the jingle. He was annoyed with her, no doubt, for refusing to stay, and leaving her to become wet and chilled in the open doorway was to be his method of punishment. The long minutes passed, and still he did not come. If this was his system of revenge, the plan was without humor and lacked originality. Somewhere a clock struck 8. He had been gone over half an hour, and the place where the pony and jingle were stabled were only 5 minutes away. Mary was dispirited and tired. She had been on her legs since the early afternoon, and now that the high pitch of excitement had died away, she wanted to rest. It would be difficult to recapture the careless, irresponsible mood of the last few hours. Jem had taken his gaiety with him. At last Mary could stand it no longer, and she set off up the hill in search of him. The long street was deserted, save for a few stragglers, who hung about on the doubtful shelter of the doorways as she had done. The rain was pitiless, and the wind came in gusts. There was nothing left now of the Christmas spirit. In a few minutes she came to the stable where they had left the pony and jingle in the afternoon. The door was locked, and peering through a crack, she saw that the shed was empty. Jem must have gone. She knocked at the little shop next door in a fever of impatience, and after a while was opened by the fellow who admitted them to the shed earlier in the day. He looked annoyed at being disturbed from the comfort of his fire, and at first did not recognize her, wild as she was in her wet shawl. "What do you want?" he said. "We don't give food to strangers here." "I haven't come for food," Mary replied. "I'm looking for my companion. We came here together with a pony and jingle, if you remember. I see the stable is empty. Have you seen him?" The man muttered an apology. "You'll excuse me, I'm sure. Your friend has been gone 20 minutes or more. He seemed in a great hurry, and there was another man with him. I wouldn't be sure, but he looked like one of the servants from the White Hart. They turned back in that direction, at any rate." He left no message, I suppose? No, I'm sorry, he did not. Maybe you'll find him at the White Hart. Do you know where that is? Yes, thank you. I'll try there. Good night. The man shut the door in her face, glad enough to be rid of her, and Mary retraced her steps in the direction of the town. What should Jem want with one of the servants from the White Hart? The man must have been mistaken. There was nothing for it but to find out the truth for herself. Once more she came to the cobbled square. The White Hart looked hospitable enough, with its lighted windows, but there was no sign of the pony and Jingle. Mary's heart sank. Surely Jem had not taken the road without her. She hesitated for a moment, and then she went up to the door and passed inside. The hall seemed to be full of gentlemen, talking and laughing, and once again her country clothes and wet hair caused consternation, for a servant went up to her at once and bade her be gone. I've come in search of a Mr. Jem Merlin, said Mary firmly. He came here with a pony and Jingle and was seen with one of your servants. I'm sorry to trouble you, but I'm anxious to find him. Will you please make some inquiry? The man went off with an ill grace, while Mary waited by the entrance, turning her back on the little group of men who stood by the fire and stared. Amongst them she recognized the dealer and the little lynx-eyed man. She was aware of a sudden sense of foreboding. In a few moments the servant returned with a tray of glasses, which he distributed amongst the company by the fire, and later he appeared again with cake and ham. He took no more notice of Mary, and only when she called to him for the third time did he come towards her. I'm sorry, he said. We've plenty here tonight without wasting our time over people from the fair. There's no man here by the name of Merlin. I've asked outside, and nobody has heard of him. Mary turned at once for the door, but the lynx-eyed man was there before her. If it's the dark gypsy fellow who tried to sell my partner a pony this afternoon, I can tell you about him, he said, smiling wide and showing a row of broken teeth. Laughter broke out from the group by the fire. She looked from one to the other. What do you have to say? He was in the company of a gentleman barely 10 minutes ago, returned the lynx-eyed man, still smiling and looking her up and down. And with the help of some of us, he was persuaded to enter a carriage that was waiting by the door. He was inclined to resist us at first, but a look from the gentleman appeared to decide him. No doubt you know what became of the black pony. The price he was asking was undoubtedly high. His remark brought forth a fresh burst of laughter from the group by the fire. Mary stared steadily at the little lynx-eyed man. Do you know where he went? She asked. He shrugged his shoulders and pulled a mock face of pity. His destination is unknown to me, he said, and I regret to say that your companion left no message of farewell. However, it is Christmas Eve. The night is young yet, and you can see for yourself if no weather to remain outside. If you care to wait here until your friend chooses to return, myself and the rest of these gentlemen will be delighted to entertain you. He laid a limp hand on her shawl. What a blackguard the fellow must be to desert you, he said smoothly. Come in and rest and forget him. Mary turned her back on him without a word and passed out through the door once more. As it closed behind her, she caught the echo of his laughter. She stood in the deserted market square with the gusty wind and scattered shadows of rain for company. So the worst had happened, and the theft of the pony had been discovered. There was no other explanation. Jem had gone. Stupidly, she stared before her at the dark houses, wondering what was the punishment for theft. Did they hang men for that as well as murder? She felt ill in body, as though someone had beaten her, and her brain was in confusion. She could see nothing clearly. She could make no plans. She supposed that Jem was lost to her now anyway, and she would never see him again. The brief adventure was over. For the moment, she was stunned, and hardly knowing what to do, she began to walk aimlessly across the square towards the castle hill. If she had consented to stay in Launceston, this would never have happened. They would have gone from the shelter of the doorway and found a room in the town somewhere. They would have been beside him, and they would have loved one another. And even if he had been caught in the morning, they would have had those hours alone. Now that he was gone from her, mind and body cried out in bitterness and resentment, and she knew how much she had wanted him. It was her fault that he had been taken, and she could do nothing for him. No doubt they would hang him for this. He would die like his father before him. The castle wall frowned down upon her, and the rain ran in rivulets beside the road. There was no beauty left in Launceston any more. It was a grim, gray, hateful place, and every bend in the road hinted at disaster. She stumbled along with the mizzling rain driving in her face, caring little where she went and careless of the fact that 11 long miles lay between her and her bedroom at Jamaica Inn. If loving a man meant this pain and anguish and sickness, she wanted none of it. It did away with sanity and composure and made havoc of courage. She was a babbling child now, and once she had been indifferent and strong. The steep hill rose before her. They had clattered down it in the afternoon. She remembered the gnarled tree trunk at the gap in the hedge. Jem had whistled, and she had sung snatches of song. Suddenly she came to her senses and faltered in her steps. It was madness to walk any further. The road stretched like a white ribbon in front of her, and 2 miles of it would bring exhaustion in this wind and rain. She turned around on the slope of the hill with the winking lights of the town behind her. Someone perhaps would give her a bed for the night, or a blanket on the floor. She had no money. They would have to trust her for payment. The wind tore at her hair, and the small, stunted trees bowed in curtsies before it. It would be a wild, wet dawn to Christmas Day. She went down the road, driven like a leaf before the wind, and out of the darkness she saw a carriage crawling up the hill towards her. It looked like a beetle, stubby and black, and its progress was slow with the full force of the weather against it. She watched it with dull eyes. The sight conveyed no message to her brain except that somewhere on an unknown road Jem Merlin traveled to his death, perhaps by the same manner. The carriage had crept up to her and was passing by before she ran towards it on an impulse and called to the driver wrapped in a greatcoat on the seat. "Are you taking the Bodeman Road?" she cried. "Have you a passenger inside?" The driver shook his head and whipped on his horse, but before Mary could step aside, an arm came out of the carriage window and was laid on her shoulder. "What does Mary Yellen do alone on Launceston on Christmas Eve?" said a voice from within. The hand was firm, but the voice was gentle. A pale face stared at her from the dark interior of the carriage. White hair and white eyes beneath a black shovel hat. It was the Vicar of Alternan. Chapter 10. The vicar saves her once again. Well, hopefully saves her. Chapter 10. She watched his profile in the half-light. Sharp it was and clear, the prominent, thin nose thrust downward like the curve of a beak. His lips were narrow and colorless, pressed firm together, and he leant forward with his chin resting on a long ebony cane that he held between his knees. For the moment she could see nothing of his eyes. They were veiled by the short white lashes, and then he turned in his seat and considered her, his lashes fluttering, and the eyes that looked upon her were white also, transparent and expressionless as glass. "So we ride together for the second time," he said, and his voice was soft and low, like the voice of a woman. "Once more I have the good fortune to help you by the wayside. You're wet through the skin. You better take off your clothes." He stared at her with cold indifference, and she shrugged in some confusion with the pin that clasped her shawl. "There is a dry rug here that will serve you for the rest of the journey," he continued. "As for your feet, they will be better bare. This carriage is comparatively free from draught." Without a word, she slipped out of her soaking shawl and bodice and wrapped herself in the coarse hair blanket that he held out to her. Her hair fell from its band and hung like a curtain around her bare shoulders. She felt like a child that had been caught in an escapade and now sat with hands folded meekly together, obedient to the master's word. "Well," he said, looking gravely upon her, and she found herself at once stumbling into an explanation of her day. As before, at Alternan, there was something about him that made her untrue to herself, made her sound like a fool and an ignorant country girl, for her story was poor telling, and she came out of it badly. Just another woman who had cheapened herself at Launceston Fair and had been left by the man of her choice to find her way home alone. She was ashamed to mention Jem by name, and she introduced him lamely as a man who lived by breaking horses, and whom she had met once when wandering on the moor. And now there had been some trouble in Launceston over the sale of a pony, and she feared he had been caught in some dishonesty. She wondered what Francis Davy must think of her, riding to Launceston with a casual acquaintance, and then losing her companion in disgrace, and running around the town bedraggled and wet after nightfall, like a woman of the streets. He heard her to the end, in silence, and she heard him swallow once or twice, a trick she remembered. "So you have not been too lonely after all," he said at length. "Jamaica Inn was not so isolated as you supposed." Mary flushed in the darkness, And though he could not see her face, she knew that his eyes were upon her. She felt guilty, as though she had done wrong, and this were an accusation. "What was the name of your companion?" he asked quietly. And she hesitated a moment, awkward and uncomfortable, her sense of guilt stronger than ever. "He was my uncle's brother," she replied, aware of the reluctance in her voice, and admission dragged from her like a confession. Whatever his opinion of her had been hitherto, he was unlikely to raise it after this. Barely a week had passed since she had called Joss Merlin a murderer, and yet she had ridden from Jamaica Inn with his brother without compunction, a common barmaid who would see the fun of the fair. "You think of me ill, of course," she went on hurriedly, "mistrusting and loathing my uncle as I do. It was hardly in keeping to make a confidence of his brother. He is dishonest and a thief, I know that. He told me as much as the beginning, but beyond that—" Her voice, her words trailed off with some uncertainty. After all, Jem had denied nothing. He had made little or no attempt to defend himself when she accused him. And now she ranged herself on his side. She defended him instead without reason and against her sane judgment, bound to him already because of his hands upon her and a kiss in the dark. "You mean the brother knows nothing of the landlord's trade by night?" continued the gentle voice at her side. "He is not of the company who brings the wagons to Jamaica Inn?" Mary made a little gesture of despair. I don't know," she said. "I have no proof. He admits nothing. He shrugs his shoulders. But he told me one thing, that he had never killed a man, and I believe him. I still believe him. He said also that my uncle was running straight into the hands of the law, and they would catch him before long. You surely would not say that if he was one of the company." She spoke now to reassure herself rather than the man at her side, and Jem's innocence became suddenly of vital importance. "You told me before that you had some acquaintance with the squire," she said quickly. "Perhaps you have influence with him too. You could no doubt persuade him to deal mercifully with Jem Merlin when the time comes. After all, he is young. He could start life afresh. It would be easy enough for you in your position." His silence was an added humiliation, and feeling those cold white eyes upon her, she knew what little graceless fool he must think her, and how feminine. He must see that she was pleading for a man who had kissed her once, and that he despised her went without saying. "My acquaintance with Mr. Bassett of North Hill is of the slightest," he told her gently. "Once or twice we may have given one another a good afternoon, and we have spoken of matters relating to our respective parishes. It's hardly likely that he should spare a thief because of me, especially if the thief is guilty, and perhaps to be the brother of the landlord of Jamaica Inn." Mary said nothing. Once again, this strange man of God had spoken words of logic and wisdom, and there was no argument in reply. But she was caught in the sudden fever of love that devastates reason and wreaks havoc of logic, and therefore his words acted as an irritant and created fresh turmoil in her brain. "You appear anxious for his safety," he said, and she wondered whether it was mockery she heard in his voice, or reproof, or understanding. But quick as a flash of lightning, he continued, "And if your new friend was guilty of other things, of conspiring with his brother against the belongings, and perhaps the lives of his fellow men, what then, Mary Ellen? Would you still seek to save him?" She felt his hand upon hers, cool and impersonal. And because she was on edge after the excitement of the day, and was both frightened and frustrated in one, and loved a man against her own judgment who was now lost to her through her own fault, she broke down and began to rave like a child deprived. "I didn't bargain for this," she said fiercely. "I could face the brutality of my uncle and the pathetic dumb stupidity of Aunt Patience. Even the silence and the horror of Jamaica Inn itself could be borne without shrinking and running away. I don't mind being lonely. There's a certain grim satisfaction in this struggle with my uncle that emboldens me at times, and I feel I'll have the better of him in the long run, whatever he says or does. I'd planned to take my aunt away from him and see justice done, and then, when it was all over, to find work on a farm somewhere and live a man's life like I used to. But now I can't look ahead anymore. I can't make plans or think for myself. I go around and round in a trap, all because of a man I despise who has nothing to do with my brain or my understanding. I don't want to love like a woman or feel like a woman, Mr. Davy. There's pain that way, and suffering, and a misery that can last a lifetime. I didn't bargain for this. I don't want it." She leant back, her face against the side of the carriage, worn out by her torrent of words and already ashamed of her outburst. She did not care of what he thought of her now. He was a priest and therefore detached from her little world of storm and passion. He could have no knowledge of those things. She felt sullen and unhappy. "How old are you?" he asked abruptly. 23, she told him. She heard him swallow in the darkness, and, taking his hand away from hers, he placed it upon the ebony stick and sat in silence. The carriage climbed away from Launceston Valley and the shelter of the hedges, and was now upon the high ground leading to the open moorland, exposed to the full force of the wind and the rain. The wind was continuous, but the showers were intermittent, and now and again the wild star straggled furtively behind a low sweeping cloud and hung for an instant like a pinprick of light. Then it would go, obscured and swept away by a black curtain of rain, and from the narrow window of the carriage nothing could be seen but the square dark patch of sky. In the valley the rain had fallen with greater steadiness, and the wind, though persistent, had been moderate in strength and checked in its passage by the trees on the contour of the hill. Here on the high ground there was no such natural shelter. There was nothing but the moor on either side of the road, and above, the great black vault of the sky, and there was a scream in the wind that had not been before. Mary shivered and edged closer to her companion like a dog to his fellow. Still he said nothing, but she knew that he had turned and was looking down upon him, and for the first time she was aware of his proximity as a person. She could feel his breath on her forehead. She remembered that her wet shawl and bodice lay on the floor at her feet, and she was naked under the rough blanket. Mary, Mary, Mary. When he spoke again, she realized how near he was to her, and his voice came as a shock, confusing suddenly and unexpected. "You are very young, Mary Yellen," he said softly. "You are nothing but a chicken with a broken shell still around you. You'll come through your little crisis. Women like you have no need to shed tears over a man encountered once or twice, and the first kiss is not a thing that is remembered. You will forget your friend with his stolen pony very soon. Come now, dry your eyes. You are not the first to bite your nails over a lost lover." He made light of her problem and counted it as a thing of no account. That was her first reaction to his words. And then she wondered why he had not used the conventional phrases of comfort, said nothing about the blessings of prayer, the peace of God, and life everlasting. She remembered that last ride with him, when he had whipped his horse into a fever of speed, and how he had crouched in his seat with the reins in his hands, and he had whispered words under his breath she had not understood. Again she felt something of the same discomfort she had experienced then, a sensation of uneasiness that she connected instinctively with his freak hair and eyes, as though his physical departure from normality were a barrier between him and the rest of the world. In the animal kingdom, a freak was a thing of abhorrence, at once hunted and destroyed or driven out into the wilderness. No sooner had she thought of this than she reproached herself as narrow and unchristian. He was a fellow creature and a priest of God. But as she murmured an apology to him for having made a fool of herself before him and talking like a common girl from the streets, she reached for her clothes and began to draw them on furtively under the cover of the blanket. "So I was right in my surmise, and all has been quiet at Jamaica Inn since I saw you last," he said after a while, following some sort of train of thought. "There have been no wagons to disturb your beauty sleep, and the landlord has played alone with his glass and bottle." Mary, still fretful and anxious, with her mind on the man she had lost, brought herself back to reality with an effort. She had forgotten her uncle for nearly 10 hours. At once she remembered the full horror of the past week and the new knowledge that had come to her. She thought of the interminable, sleepless nights, the long days she had spent alone, and the staring, bloodshot eyes of her uncle swung before her again, his drunkard smile, his groping hands. "Mr. Davy," she whispered, "have you ever heard of wreckers?" She had never said the word aloud before. She had not considered it even, and now that she heard it from her own lips, it sounded fearful and obscene, like a blasphemy. It was too dark in the carriage to see the effect upon his face, but she heard him swallow. His eyes were hidden from her under his black shovel hat, and she could see only the dim outline of his profile, the sharp chin, the prominent nose. Once, years ago, when I was hardly more than a child, I heard a neighbor speak of them, she said. And then later, when I was old enough to understand, there were rumors of these things, snatches of gossip quickly suppressed. One of the men would bring back some wild tale after a visit to the north coast, and he would be silenced at once. Such talk was forbidden by the older men. It was an outraged decency. I believed none of these stories. I asked my mother, and she told me they were the horrible inventions of evil-minded people. Such things did not and could not exist. But she was wrong. I know she was wrong, Mr. Davy. My uncle is one of them. He told me so himself. Still, her companion made no reply. He sat motionless, like a stone thing, and she went on again, never raising her voice above a whisper. They are in it, every one of them, from the coast to the Tamar bank. All those men I saw that first Saturday in the bar at the inn. The gypsies, poachers, sailors, the peddler with the broken teeth. They've murdered women and children with their own hands. They've held them under the water. They've killed them with rocks and stones. Those are death wagons that travel the road by night, and the goods they carry are not smuggled casks alone, with brandy for some and tobacco for another, but the full cargo of wrecked ships, bought at the price of blood, and the trust and the possession of murdered men. That's why my uncle is feared and loathed by the timid people in the cottages and farms, and why all doors are barred against him, and why the coaches drive past his house in a cloud of dust. They suspect what they cannot prove. My aunt lives in mortal danger of discovery, and my uncle has only to lose himself in drink before a stranger, and his secret is spilt to the four winds. There, Mr. Davy. Now you know the truth about Jamaica Inn. She leant back, breathless, against the side of the carriage, biting her lips and twisting her hands in an emotion she could not control, exhausted and shaken by the torrent of words that had escaped her. And somewhere in the dark places of her mind an image fought for recognition and found its way into the light, having no mercy on her feelings. And it was the face of Jem Merlin, the man she loved, grown evil and distorted, merging horribly and finally into that of his brother. The face beneath the black shovel hat turned towards her. She caught a flicker of the white lashes, and the lips moved. So the landlord talks when he's drunk, he said. And it seemed to Mary that his voice lacked something of its usual gentle quality. It rang sharper in tone, as though pitched in a higher note. But when she looked up at him, his eyes stared back at her, cold and impersonable as ever. He talks. Yes, she answered him. When my uncle has lived on brandy for 5 days, he'll bare his soul before the world. He told me so himself the very first evening I arrived. He was not drunk then. But 4 days ago, when he had woken from his first stupor, and he came out into the kitchen after midnight, swaying on his 2 feet, he talked then. That's why I know. And that's perhaps why I've lost faith in humanity and in God and in myself, and why I acted like a fool today in Launceston. The gale had increased in force during their conversation, and now, with a bend in the road, the carriage headed straight into the wind and was brought almost to a standstill. The vehicle rocked on its high wheels, and a sudden shower splattered against the windows like a handful of pebbles. There was no particle of shelter now. The moor on either hand was bare and unprotected, and the scurrying clouds flew past the land, tearing themselves asunder on the tors. There was a salt, wet tang in the wind that had come from the sea 15 miles away. Francis Davy leant forward in his seat. We are approaching 5 lanes and the turning to Alterman, he said. The driver is bound to Bowden will take you to Jamaica Inn. I shall leave you at 5 lanes and walk down into the village. Am I the only man you have honored with your confidence, or do I share it with the landlord's brother? Again, Mary could not tell if there was irony or a mockery in his voice. Jem Merlin knows, she said unwillingly. We spoke of it this morning. He said little, though, and I know he is not friendly with my uncle. Anyway, it doesn't matter now. Jem rides to custody for another crime. And suppose he could save his own skin by betraying his brother. What then, Mary Ellen? There is a consideration for you. Mary started. This was a new possibility, and for a moment she clutched at the straw. But the vicar of Alternan must have read her thoughts, for glancing up at him for confirmation of her hopes, she saw him smile, the thin line of his mouth breaking for a moment out of passivity, as though his face were a mask and the mask had cracked. She looked away, uncomfortable, feeling like one who stumbles unawares upon a sight forbidden. That would be a relief to you and to him, no doubt, continued the vicar, if he had ever been involved. But there's always doubt, isn't there? And neither you nor I know the answer to that question. A guilty man does not usually tie the rope around his own neck. Mary made a helpless movement with her hands, and he must have seen the despair on her face, for his voice became gentle again, that had been harsh hitherto, and he laid his hand on her knee. Our bright days are done, and we are for the dark, he said. If it were permitted to take our text from Shakespeare, there would be strange sermons preached in Cornwall tomorrow, Mary Yellen. Your uncle and his companions are not members of my congregation, however, and if they were, they would not understand me. You shake your head at me. I speak in riddles. This man is no comforter, you say. He is a freak with his white hair and eyes. Don't turn away. I know what you think. I will tell you one thing for consolation. You can make of it what you will. A week from now will bring the new year. The false lights have flickered for the last time, and there will be no more wrecks. The candles will be blown. I don't understand you, said Mary. How do you know this, and what has the new year got to do with it? He took his hand from hers and began to fasten his coat preparatory to the departure. He lifted the sash of the window and called to the driver to rein in his horse, and the cold air rushed into the carriage with the sting of frozen rain. I returned tonight from a meeting in Launceston, which was but a sequel to many other similar meetings during the past few years. And those of us present were informed at last that His Majesty's government was preparing to take certain steps during the coming year to patrol the coasts of His Majesty's country. There will be watchers on the cliffs instead of flares, and the paths known only at present to men like your uncle and his companions will be trodden by officers of the law. There will be a chain across England, Mary, that will be very hard to break. Now do you understand? He opened the door of the carriage and stepped out into the road. He bared his head into the rain, and she saw the thick white hair frame his face like a halo. He smiled again to her and bowed, and he reached for her hand once more and held it a moment. Your troubles are over, he said. The wagon wheels will rust, and the barred rooms at the end of the passage will be turned into a parlor. Your aunt will sleep in peace again, and your uncle will either drink himself to death and be a riddance to all of you, or he will turn Wesleyan and preach to travelers on the high road. As for you, you will ride south again and find a lover. Sleep well tonight. Tomorrow is Christmas Day, and the bells at Altrincham will be ringing for peace and goodwill. I shall think of you. He waved his hand to the driver, and the carriage went on without him. Mary leant out the window to call to him, but he had turned to the right down one of the 5 lanes and was already lost to sight. The carriage rattled on along the bottom road. There were still 3 miles to cover before the tall chimneys of Jamaica Inn broke upon the skyline, and those miles were the wildest and most exposed of all the long 120 that stretched between the 2 towns. Mary wished now that she had gone with Francis Davy. She would not hear the wind at Altrincham, and the rain would fall silently in the sheltered lane. Tomorrow she could have knelt in the church and prayed for the first time since leaving Helford. If what he said was true, then there would be cause for rejoicing after all, and there would be some sense in giving thanks. The day of the wrecker was over. He would be broken by the new law, he and his kind. They would be blotted out and razed from the countryside as the pirates had been 20, 30 years ago. There would be no memory of them any more, no record left to poison the minds of those who should come after. A new generation would be born who had never heard their name. Ships would come to England without fear. There would be no harvest with the tide. Coves that had sounded once with the crunch of footsteps on shingles and the whispered voices of men would be silent again, and the scream that broke upon the silence would be the scream of a gull. Beneath the placid surface of the sea, on the ocean bed, lay skulls without a name, green coins that had once been gold, and the old bones of ships. They would be forgotten forevermore. The terror they had known died with them. It was a dawn of a new age, when men and women would travel without fear, and the land would belong to them. Here, on this stretch of moor, farmers could till their plots of soil and stack the sods of turf to dry under the sun as they did today, but the shadow that had been upon them would have vanished. Perhaps the grass would grow and the heather bloom again where Jamaica had stood. She sat in the corner of the carriage with the vision of the new world before her, And through the open window, traveling down upon the wind, she heard a shot ring out in the silence of the night, and a distant shout and a cry. The voices of men came out of the darkness, and the padding of feet upon the road. She leant out of the window, the rain blowing in her face, and she heard the driver of the carriage call out in fear as his horse shied and stumbled. The road rose steeply from the valley, winding away to the top of the hill, and there in the distance were the lean chimneys of Jamaica Inn crowning the skyline like a gallows. Down the road came a company of men, led by one who leapt like a hare and tossed a lantern before him as he ran. Another shot rang out, and the driver of the carriage crumpled in his seat and fell. The horse stumbled and headed like a blind thing for the ditch. For a moment, the carriage swayed upon its wheels, rocked, and was still. Somebody screamed a blasphemy to the sky. Somebody laughed wildly. There was a whistle and a cry. A face was thrust in at the window of the carriage, a face crowned with matted hair that fell in a fringe above the scarred, bloodshot eyes. The lips parted, showing the white teeth, and then a lantern was lifted to the window so that the light could fall upon the interior of the carriage. One hand held the lantern, and the other clasped the smoking barrel of a pistol. They were long, slim hands, with narrow, pointed fingers, things of beauty and of grace, the rounded nails crusted with dirt. Joss Merlin smiled, the crazy, delirious smile of a man possessed, maddened, and exalted by poison, and he leveled the pistol at Mary, leaning forward into the carriage so that the barrel touched her throat. Then he laughed and threw the pistol back over his shoulders, and wrenching open the door, he reached for her hands and pulled her out beside him on the road, holding the lantern above his head so that all could see her. There were 10 or 12 of them standing in the road, ragged and ill-kept, half of them drunk as their leader, wild eyes staring out of shaggy, bearded faces, and 1 or 2 had pistols in their hands or in the air. One fellow burst into a snatch of song, waving a bottle over his head, reeling on his feet as he stood. Then he staggered and fell, crumpled onto his face in the ditch. The peddler kicked him as he lay, and he did not stir, and snatching the bridle of the horse, he dragged the animal forward, urging him with blows and cries to the steep hill, while the wheels of the carriage passed over the body of the fallen man, who, kicking for an instant like a wounded hare, struggled from the mud with a scream of terror and pain, and then lay still. The men turned with the carriage and followed it, the sound of their running feet pattering along the high road, and Joss Merlin stood for a moment looking down upon Mary with a foolish, drunken smile. Then, on a sudden impulse, he caught her in his arms and pulled her towards the carriage, wrenching the door once more. He threw her onto the seat in the corner, and then, leaning out of the window, he yelled to the peddler to whip the horse up the hill. His cry was echoed by the man who ran beside him, and some of them leapt onto the step and clung to the window, while others mounted the driver's empty seat and rained at the horse with sticks and shower of stones. The animal quivered, sweating with fear, and he topped the hill at a gallop with 6 madmen clinging to the reins and screaming at his heels. Jamaica Inn was ablaze with light. The doors were open and the windows were unbarred. The house gaped out of the night like a live thing. The landlord placed his hand over Mary's mouth and forced her back against the side of the carriage. "You'd inform against me, would you?" he said. "You'd run to the law and have me swing on a rope's end like a cat? All right, then you shall have your chance. You shall stand on the shore, Mary, with the wind and the sea in your face, and you shall watch for the dawn and the coming in of the tide. You know what that means, don't you? You know where I'm going to take you." She stared back at him in horror. The color drained from her face, and she tried to speak to him, but his hands forbade her. "You think you're not afraid of me, don't you?" he said. "You sneer at me with your pretty white face and your monkey eyes. Yes, I'm drunk. I'm drunk as a king, and heaven and earth can smash for all I care. Tonight we shall ride in glory, every man jack of us, maybe for the last time. And you shall come with us, Mary, to the coast." He turned away from her, shouting to his companions, and the horse, startled by his cry, started forward again in his stride, dragging the carriage behind him, and the lights of Jamaica Inn vanished in the darkness. Chapter 10 was a doozy. My goodness. Oof. All right. Chapter 11. We will not get through chapter 11, but I will go as far as we can. It was a nightmare journey of 2 hours or more to the coast, and Mary, bruised and shaken by her rough handling, lay exhausted in the corner of the carriage, caring little what became of her. Harry the peddler and 2 other men had climbed in beside her uncle, and the air became foul at once with the stink of tobacco and stale drink and the smell of their bodies. The landlord had worked himself and his companions into a state of wild excitement, and the presence of a woman amongst them vicious tang to their enjoyment, weakness and distress acting pleasurably upon them. At first they talked at her and for her, laughing and singing to win her notice. Harry the peddler bursting into his lewd songs, which rang with immoderate force in such close quarters, and brought howls of appreciation from his audience, stimulating them to greater excitement. They watched for the effect upon her face, hoping that she would show some sign of shame or discomfort, but Mary was too tired now for any word or song to penetrate her. She heard their voices through a haze of exhaustion. She was aware of her uncle's elbows thrust in her side, bringing another dull ache to add to her pains. And with throbbing head and smarting eyes, she saw a sea of grinning faces through the smoke. What they said or did hardly mattered to her any more, and the longing for sleep and for forgetfulness became a torrent. When they saw how lifeless she was and dull, her presence lost its flavor. Even the songs lost sting, and Joss Merlin fumbled in his pocket and produced a pack of cards. They turned from her at once to this new interest, and in the momentary lull that blessed her, Mary shrank closer in her corner, away from the hot animal smell of her uncle, and closing her eyes, she resigned herself to the movement of the swaying, jolting carriage. Her fatigue was such that full consciousness was no longer part of her. She was swinging in a trance land between the border. She was aware of pain and the rocking carriage wheels, and in the far distance a murmur of voices. But these things moved away from her and not with her. She could not identify them with her own existence. Darkness came upon her like a boon from heaven, and she felt herself slip into it and was so lost. Time had nothing to do with her then. It was the cessation of movement that dragged her back to the world, the sudden stillness and the cold, damp air blowing upon her face through the open carriage window. She was alone in her corner. The men had gone, taking their light with them. She sat motionless at first, fearing to bring them back and uncertain what had befallen her. And then, when she leant forward to the window, the pain and stiffness in her body were intolerable. A wheal of pain ran across her shoulders where the cold had numbed her, and her bodice was still damp from the rain that had soaked her early in the evening. She waited a moment and then leant forward again. It was still blowing hard, but the driving rain had ceased, and only a thin, cold mizzle pattered against the window. The carriage had been abandoned in a narrow gullyway with high banks on either side, and the horse had been taken from the traces. The gully appeared to descend sharply, the path becoming rough and broken. Mary could not see more than a few yards in front of her. The night had thickened considerably, and in the gullyway it was black like a pit. There were no stars now in the sky, and the sharp wind of the moors had become a boisterous thing of noise and bluster, trailing a wet fog for company. Mary put her hand out of the window and touched the bank. Her fingers came upon loose sand and stems of grass, sodden through with the rain. She tried the handle of the door, but it was locked. Then she listened intently. Her eyes strained to pierce the darkness ahead of her, down the sharp descent of the gullyway, and borne up to her on the wild came a sound at once sullen and familiar, a sound that for the first time in her life she could not welcome but must recognize with a leap of her heart and a shiver of foreboding. It was the sound of the sea. The gully was a pathway to the shore. She knew now why a softness had crept upon the air, and why the mizzle of rain fell on her hand lightly with a tang of salt. The high banks gave a false feeling of shelter in contrast to the bleak wilderness of the moors. But once away from their deceptive shadow, the illusion would be lost, and the tearing gale cry louder than ever. There would be no stillness where the sea broke upon the rock-bound shore. She heard it again now, and continually. A murmur and a sigh as the spent water gave itself to the strand and withdrew it reluctantly, and then a pause as the sea gathered itself for a renewal of effort, a momentary fragment in time, and then once more the thunder and the crash of fulfillment, the roar of surf upon shingle and the screaming scatter of stones as they followed the drag of the sea. Mary shuddered. Somewhere in the darkness below, her uncle and his companions waited for the tide. She could have heard some sound of them, The waiting of the empty carriage would have been more bearable. The wild shouting, the laughter, and the singing with which they had forfeited themselves on the journey would have been a relief, however loathsome. But this deadly quietude was sinister. Business had sobered them, and they found work for their hands. Now that her senses were her own again, and her first fatigue cast aside, Mary found inactivity impossible. She considered the size of the window. The door was locked, as she knew, but with straining and wriggling she might yet attempt to squeeze her body through the narrow frame. The endeavor was worth a risk. Whatever happened tonight, her own life would be counted of little value. Her uncle and his companions could find her and kill her if they wished. This country was known to them and not to her. They could trace her in a moment if they wanted, like a pack of hounds. She worked and strained at the window, leaning backwards through the gap. The effort made even more because of her stiff shoulder and her back. The roof of the carriage was slippery and wet, giving no grip to her fingers, but she struggled and pushed through the gap, and then, with a sickening squeeze and pressure, her hips were through, the frame of the window scraping the flesh and turning her faint. She lost a foothold and balance and fell backwards through the window to the ground below. The drop was nothing, but the fall shook her, and she felt a little trickle of blood run down her side where the window had caught her. She gave herself a moment to recover, and then she dragged herself to her feet and began to creep uncertainly up the lane in the dark shelter of the bank. She had not yet formed a plan in her head, but with her back turned away from the gully and the sea, she would be putting distance between herself and her late companions. There was little doubt they had descended to the shore. This lane, winding upwards and to the left, would take her at least to the high ground of the cliffs, where in spite of the darkness she would be able to make something of the land. Somewhere there would be a road. The carriage itself must have traveled by one, and if there was a road, there would be dwelling houses before long. There would be honest men and women to whom she could tell her tale, and who would rouse the countryside when they heard her story. She felt her way along the narrow ditch, stumbling now and again over the stones, her hair blowing into her eyes and tumbling around her. And coming suddenly around the sharp corner of the bank, she put up her hands to screw back the loose strands from her eyes. And because of this, she did not see the humped figure of a man kneeling in the ditch with his back towards her, his eyes watchful of the winding lane ahead. She came against him, knocking the breath from her body, and he, taken by surprise, fell with her, crying out in mingled terror and rage, smashing at her with his clenched fists. They fought on the ground, she straining away from him, her hands tearing at his face. But in a moment he was too strong for her, and rolling her over on her side, he twisted his hands in her hair, pulling at the roots until the pain forced her to stillness. He leant on her, breathing heavily, for the fall had winded him, and then he peered closely at her, his gaping mouth showing yellow, broken teeth. It was Harry the peddler. Mary lay motionless. The first move should come from him. And meanwhile she cursed herself for a fool in blundering up the lane the way she had, with never a thought of the outpost that even a child at play would have placed in his position. He expected her to cry or struggle, but when she did neither, he shifted his weight to his elbow and smiled at her slyly, jerking his head in the direction of the shore. "Didn't think you'd see me, did you?" he said. "Thought I was down on the shore with the landlord and the rest, beating the pots. And so you woke up from your beauty sleep and took a walk up the lane. And now you're here, I'll make you very welcome." He grinned at her, touching her cheek with a black female. "It's been cold and damp in the ditch," he said. "That's no odds now. There'll be hours down there yet. I can see you've turned against Joss by the way you spoke to him tonight. He's no right to keep you up at Jamaica like a bird in a cage with no pretty things to wear. I doubt if he's given you as much as a brooch for your bodice, has he? Don't you mind about that. I'll give you lace for your neck and bangles for your wrist and short silk for your skin. Let's look now." He nodded to her, reassuring her, smiling, still smirky and sly, and she felt his furtive hand fasten itself upon her. She moved swiftly, lashing out at him, and her fist caught him underneath the chin, shutting his mouth like a trap, with his tongue caught beneath his teeth. He squealed like a rabbit, and she struck him again, but this time he grabbed at her and lurched sideways upon her, all pretense of gentle persuasion gone, his strength horrible, his face drained of all color. He was fighting now for possession, and she knew it, and aware that his strength was greater than hers and must prevail in the end, She lay limp suddenly to deceive him, giving him the advantage for the moment. He grunted in triumph, relaxing his weight, which is what she had intended. And as he moved his position and lowered his head, she jabbed at him swiftly with the full force of his knee, at the same time thrusting her fingers in his eyes. He doubled up at once, rolling onto his side in agony, and in a second she had struggled from under him and pulled herself onto her feet, kicking him once more as she rocked defensiveless, his hands clasped to his belly. She grabbed in the ditch for a stone to fling at him, finding nothing but loose earth and sand, and she dug handfuls of this, scattering it in his eyes and his face, so that he was blinded momentarily and could make no return. Then she turned again and began to run like a hunted thing up the twisting lane, her mouth open, her hands outstretched, tripping and stumbling over the ruts in the path. And when she heard his shout behind him once more, and the padding of his feet, a sense of panic swamped her reason, and she started to climb up the high bank that bordered the lane, her foot slipping at every step in the soft earth, until with very madness of effort, born in terror, she reached the top and crawled, sobbing, through a gap in the thorn hedge that bordered the bank. Her face and her hands were bleeding, but she had no thought of this, and ran along the cliff, away from the lane, over tussocks of grass and humped uneven ground, all sense of direction gone from her, her one idea to escape from the thing that was Harry the peddler. I think I'm going to end there because that's pretty terrifying. Yeah, worst day ever. Terrible day. And not ending anytime soon. Like, oof, not ending anytime soon. All right. So we are at page 210, 210, and we're trying to run away from Harry the peddler, who was just trying to do terrible things to her. Yeah, it just keeps getting worse, which, I mean, that's about right. Yeah, so those are a storytelling world reader people. We're in the middle, almost to the, well, not almost to the end, but like we're at the climax. We're where everything's getting real and things are becoming terrifying. So, we've lost a couple people today. A few people died. And I hope the horse is okay. I always worry about the horses in these stories and in these movies. But care of animals was not their high priority. So there we go. Next time, page 210. We're running from Harry. We hopefully will get out alive. Fingers crossed. Until then, I wish you a very, very safe day, a fantastic afternoon. Thank you for joining me today. And I will see you next time when we get back to Jamaica Inn. Have a fantastic day, everybody. Bye.